Hey everyone, welcome to Singularity Computers Client Build 20 Part 2. The name of this build is Event Horizon. At the end of the last video, I was test fitting the custom reservoir mounting plate that I've made for this build. I was also test fitting the motherboard, graphics cards and power supply to get the measurements for the custom cables for the core components, which is something I always do early in my builds because there's obviously a lot of work involved in these cables. So it's something you should always start early in a build. Now in this part of the build log, I'm mainly going to focus on completing the mods. Despite the fact that I've already completed the custom paint on the case and radiators, there is still a lot of mods to be done. First of all, the motherboard. As I mentioned in the last video, I'm going to be changing the color scheme of this motherboard from red and black to black, and I might also add some blue accents to fit the color scheme of the build. Now I've just found out that there's actually a black version of this motherboard going to be released soon. It's called the MSI X99A Godlike Carbon Edition, and full black color scheme with carbon fiber accents. It's an amazing looking board and it would have suited this build perfectly, but obviously we didn't know that when we started this build, and modifying this motherboard means that it's going to be completely unique and one of a kind, and really that's what this is all about. Another small mod that I need to complete is I need to drill 2 holes through the mid panel of this case, and this is a mod that I often do to K-Slabs cases, in particular the TH10A. It massively cleans up the water cooling loops, it shortens them, removes unnecessary tube. I mean, having to run the tube through the cable routing holes is really not a good idea, and designing the loops to avoid going through the mid plate means they're just so much more of a mess. So these 2 holes means you can run the loops from the back side of the build where they end up if you stick to the rules that I have for water cooling loops. And the rules that I have is take the shortest possible tubing routing. So you figure out the best component order that gives you the shortest possible tubing routing. It's all about, minimalism, efficiency, and in the end performance and aesthetics is what you get out of sticking to those rules. And the other rule is never cross tubing. So I've now installed the radiators, as you can see, and I had already installed the fans and done the cable management for them. Now drilling these holes through the mid panel is something I'd normally do before custom paint, obviously, but as long as you're careful, you can drill them after custom paint. And the reason I've done this is because I need a lot of the components to be able to test fit them to get the positions of these holes. And I often do my custom paint jobs long before the rest of the components arrive, which means that doing these holes before custom paint would massively delay my builds. So I do this to save a lot of time, and it really does no harm. It's an aluminium case. Having a little bit of bare metal around the inside of the hole is certainly not a problem, and the bits power through fittings that you can see I've used really clean things up nicely. You can see that I've completed the custom paint on the custom reservoir mounting plate, and I did the same thing that I did on the radiators, the Black Magic Black Metallic, and then I mixed a blue flake with the clear coat, and it's turned out really well. Again, a show car finish. I've cut the orange peel flat and polished the panel so it looks like a mirror. I've also used dust filters on all of the intakes, but we'll take a look at that a little bit later in the build. I'm now starting the motherboard mods, and the first thing I need to do is obviously completely dismantle this board. So I'm removing the heat sinks and covers, and it's just a few screws to remove the lower 2 heat sinks and cover, and the top 2 heat sinks and rear I/O cover. And MSI obviously knew that people were going to be installing water blocks, and in some cases it may just be a MOSFET water block, or it might just be a water block for the X99 chipset. So this board has been very well thought out and designed. MSI has made it easy to remove everything, to dismantle everything, and also to divide the heat sinks from the cover. It's only 2 screws to remove the covers from the heat sinks. So it's a great board to modify and to water cool. Now this EK MSI X99 X Power water block, I have no idea how it ended up with this build. I think it's something that I had in stock from an older build, but it certainly doesn't fit this motherboard. And I'm not actually going to be using a motherboard water block in this build at all, because there's currently only one water block for this motherboard from Bits Power. It's a full cover block, and EK water blocks were preferred for this build. So we didn't want a mix of different water blocks, and the client didn't want to use all Bits Power water blocks. I look forward to the day I can use Bits Power water blocks in a build, because Bits Power now has some amazing blocks, and the full cover block would have solved a lot of the problems for this build. It would have meant less modding for the motherboard, but I certainly don't mind. I prefer the option of modifying this board. I'm having a great time doing it, and you know, it's an easy board to modify, and that's really a compliment to any component. Something that is easy to modify, it generally goes hand in hand with high quality, and it certainly does with this board. Now you can see this cover, this fits over the heatsink on the X99 chipset, so the lower large heatsink. And this cover is definitely needed because it covers up one of the LED strips, so I cannot do without it. But the rest of the heatsink covers I've removed, and I won't be reinstalling because the heat sinks look amazing without them. Underneath them we have these beautiful milled black brushed aluminium heat sinks. It's cleaner without them. You can see the covers here. So it, you know, better suits the aesthetics for this build. It fits the color scheme. It means that I don't even need to touch the heat sinks, which is great. And also I had no choice but to damage these little covers because they're only 0.5mm aluminium. They're like alfoil as I was removing them, because they were stuck in position with such strong adhesive, and even with a heat gun and trying to cut them off and being very careful, I couldn't preserve them. And I even did a little bit of damage to this cover, which as you can see I'm starting to repair. Just a couple of small bends, so it was very easy to repair with a piece of copper and a rubber mallet. And you know, the reason I'm using copper is because it's nice and soft. And I've now sandblasted all of these components. So this is all of the covers, and also the box for the killer NIC, the Wi-Fi, which as you can see actually plugs into the motherboard. It's removable, which is great again for the mods. One screw to remove it, one screw to dismantle the cover. A lot of people probably expected me to anodize these components because they were already anodized, and anodizing is a capability that I have. Now anodizing brand new aluminium is fine, but something that is this thin, by the time you sandblast it, because that's really the only way of removing all of the old anodizing, and then you know, the sulfuric acid, which is part of the anodizing process, the components just end up too thin and it's too risky. And I wasn't going to be able to match the color scheme of this build as well, anodizing. So to perfectly match the color scheme, to match the aesthetics of the build, painting was the best option. So you can see that I've painted all of the covers with the same black metallic called Black Magic that I've used on the case and the radiators, except for the cover that fits on this heatsink, which I'm actually going to do in a special chrome paint, which I'm really looking forward to. It's an amazing looking paint from DNA. Very expensive, very long process. It takes about 2 weeks because there's so many different layers and products, so a lot of dry time. So I'm really looking forward to doing that. But the thing is, I don't really have 2 weeks for this build, and you know, for such a small component, a lot of this I'm already doing more than what I was asked, which I always do for my clients. And so if I make small changes, and I may not do the chrome, I may just do a blue accent instead, it's really no big deal. So you can see I have a lot of different adhesive here, which I'm going to need to reassemble the covers and the heat sinks, because one of the LED strips was stuck to one of the covers, the PCIe area cover. So that's the only LED strip I had to remove to do all of these mods. The rest of the LED strips I was able to leave in position because they're on the heat sinks, which I didn't need to do anything to. So I used 3M double-sided tape to reinstall that LED strip. I also needed to use some adhesive felt on the bottoms of some of the covers to prevent vibration. And you can see how all of this has turned out. The killer NIC box, all of it, I'm really happy with the way it's turned out. And I've now waxed it, which has, means a much nicer finish. I was going to polish it, but now that I've waxed it, I think it definitely looks nice enough. And I've started work on the other cover. You can see that I've primed it, and I'm now going to move on to the first part of the chroming process, which is actually a black base coat. Now I just thought I'd show you my new gun. I've really been wanting to, despite the fact that the quality of my custom paint is I'm just being honest here, better than I've been able to get from any professional that I've worked with. And I've worked with about 6 different professional painters now, talked to many around the world. You know, I still want to keep improving the quality of my custom paint and also the efficiency. And the best way to do that right now would be a spray booth. But I did have a spray booth in my workshop, and a lot of you know what happened to that. I was very sad to lose my spray booth because it was a big thing for me, very important. But, you know, it's something that would be incredibly costly more costly than building my own house almost, you know, so it's just not possible right now. So the best way for me to improve quality right now, I'm getting show car finishes, you know, I'm very happy with my quality, but I have purchased a new gun. It's the Developers GTI Pro, used by many professionals around the world. Incredible quality gun, and I'm really enjoying using it. So you can see all of the DNA products here that are needed for the chrome. Incredible amount of products for one tiny little panel. It's lucky that I'm also going to be doing a case at the same time, so that works out well. I have now reinstalled all of the heat sinks and covers onto the motherboard. I've also installed the CPU and the Samsung SM951 512GB M.2 PCIe SSD onto the motherboard, and you can see how it's all turned out. You can see how important the killer Nick box actually was. If that wasn't painted, it's highly visible. You know, it was red, so that was a very important component to paint, and I was very happy to see that it could easily be unplugged from the motherboard. Now we still have some red connectors back here on the rear I/O, but that's certainly no big deal. It's out of sight. And there's only one connector on the motherboard that's actually red, and it's the USB 3 header. So all I need to do is just plug a connector into that on its own, and that will sort that out nicely. So I'm really happy with the way this has turned out. You can see the metallic is quite subtle. Now keep in mind, everything you're looking at here is under bright white light, so it shows up every little imperfection. And that is the way I prefer to build. I always have bright white light so that I don't miss anything. It sometimes drives you crazy because, you know, in normal light, compared to normal light, you see things that you would never normally see. And so the level of quality just has to be so much higher, you know, if you're going to be that fussy. But it also means that you guys never miss a thing. Any slight mistake that I make, you are going to see. I'm preparing to install the water blocks onto the memory and the EK Monarch module adapters. So I have the Corsair 32GB kit of Vengeance LPX. And some of you might be wondering why I'm not using Corsair Dominator Platinum, which, you know, most people would use in a high-end build, and I normally use. Well, you can't water cool that memory because the PCBs, the memory modules are actually bigger, and they don't fit the Monarch module adapters. It's interesting that EK's first memory water blocks were designed for Corsair Dominator, but then Corsair went and changed their memory so that you couldn't water cool it. Not such a great decision, because I really love these EK Monarch module adapters. I think they look great on their own just as air cooling. And I have a great suggestion for EK, and I hope to see this, because I've often done this. I've made a suggestion and a couple of months later I see it. I think EK should make some tops for air cooling for their Monarch module adapters. You know, they could do different colored anodized tops, they could do nickel plated tops, because I like to use Monarch module adapters without water blocks sometimes. You know, they look great. But for this build, I'm certainly going to be installing water blocks, and whenever I use memory water blocks, people say they're not necessary. Yes, you are right. They are not necessary. Memory will work without them. And even you can overclock the memory without them. But a lot of people like them for aesthetics, and I can certainly understand that, considering that I was the very first person to start using hardline tube in builds, and the first place I used it was between the water blocks on the motherboard. One day, you know, I started building a system and there were so many water blocks so close together. It was the first of, I think it was X79, where you had 2 banks of memory on either side. It meant 1 extra water block on the motherboard area, and things were just becoming too tight for soft tube. So I started using Bits Power Crystal Link, and that's what kicked off the whole acrylic tube trend. A build called Nighthawk, which was client build 5. So yes, I can definitely understand installing extra water blocks, purely for the sake of aesthetics, even though I am a minimalist and prefer an understated, subtle look and, you know, pure efficiency. So I've removed the heat sinks from the memory. Always a difficult task, well, almost always, because, you know, particularly for this memory where the only thing holding the heat sinks in position is actually the adhesive TIM. It goes to show how strong that adhesive TIM actually is. The only way to remove these heat sinks is to heat them up with a heat gun. You need to be careful doing that, not to apply too much heat, because then you can damage the memory. Because a heat gun, I mean, you can get something almost glowing red hot. So you do need to be careful and only apply enough heat where you can still actually touch the component. And, you know, even that is usually not enough. It's still very difficult. And you often need to put so much pressure that it starts to get a little bit scary. But just move slowly, be careful, twist side to side as much as you can to break that seal. And eventually you're going to get there, hopefully without ripping off some ICs straight off the memory itself. You can see I'm now installing the TIM thermal pads ready for the installation of the Monarch module adapters. And I've put down some thermal paste first to help the thermal pads to stick. This is something that EK recommends, or at least they used to recommend. And, you know, I usually do it. Even though it can create a little bit more mess if you're not careful, it does definitely help the thermal pads to stick, which means they're not dropping off as you're trying to install water blocks. So, you know, it's not really for performance, it's just purely to help them stick. And I use Arctic MX4. I've actually always used Arctic TIM for many, many years now. So you can see how easy it is to install the Monarch module adapters. You just install the TIM onto one side of the memory, flip it over, lay it onto one half of the Monarch module adapter, and then screw the other half on top. And these are nice CNC machined aluminium heat sinks. There was originally a problem with these, and you can see I have a couple of the older Monarch module adapters here and a couple of the newer ones. On the newer ones, the threads go all the way through because EK was having problems with the threads stripping because they were so short and a small thread. So they fixed this by making the threads go all the way through and lengthening the bolts. So it's good to see this has been sorted out because I have had problems with these stripping. I've actually lost a couple of these in the past that way. You can see that I laid down some thermal paste before I installed the water blocks. You can actually use thermal pads, but thermal paste is certainly enough. I mean, this is for aesthetics. There's good contact there anyway. So again, my MX4. So I've installed the Corsair AX1200i and I used the mounting plate for the power supply. This strengthens the back of the case, and this is necessary on a few K-subs cases if you're going to be using big heavy power supplies. You can certainly do without it, but you do get a bit of flex in the case. And because I'm shipping my builds around the world, something like this I always install to get some extra strength. So you can see I've now installed the Monarch module adapters, the memory water blocks. I've installed the memory onto the motherboard. So the motherboard I've also installed onto the motherboard tray, screwed it down. It's getting very close to being ready to install this into the build. I just need to install the graphics cards, but I can't do that until I've installed that last little cover panel onto the X99 chipset heatsink. And I'll also do some of the tubing on the motherboard outside of the build, the benefits of a removable motherboard tray. At this point, the small remaining cover for the motherboard is holding up the entire build, and there's still 2 weeks of painting to go to chrome it, so it's just not going to be worth it. And I think that a blue accent will actually look better anyway. So I've sandblasted this component, and after sandblasting it for the second time, the paint was very difficult to remove. I mean, the DNA paints I use are incredibly high quality. They bite into the surface, and they're even more difficult to remove by far than anodizing. And so I've actually lost a bit of the MSI logo, and I don't want something on here with half a logo, so I decided to cut out a new piece of 0.5mm aluminium. So it's basically exactly the same, except it doesn't have the little side pieces And, you know, so it's slightly different, but I'm about to paint this component. And what I'm going to do is the black magic, black metallic, and then I'm going to use the blue flake, but I'm going to use a lot more of it. So there's going to be a lot more sparkle. You know, this piece is hidden under the graphics cards. It's small. It's going to be mostly out of sight. So I think something that stands out a little more as an accent is going to work nicely. And this process for painting only takes a couple of days. I have the rest of the components laid out here ready to install. I'm about to install the custom reservoir mounting plate and also the pump and reservoir configurations. I also need to install the aquapipe ones, which are a critical component for any water cooling system where you're going to be running your loops back to the top of the reservoir, because they bring the coolant, the incoming coolant, below the level of the coolant in the reservoir, which stops trickle and stops air from going back into the loop. So I've slid the motherboard into position temporarily, and I often leave the motherboard inside of the case even though things are not complete, because it's a lot safer here. It's kind of a risk of a removable motherboard tray. If you have it laying around outside of the build, it's easy to drop things on it or something, so I prefer to keep it nice and safe inside of the build. And that way, you know, you don't get dust settling on it either. So that's just something small that I do. You can see that I've installed the res mounting plate. I've also installed the pump mounts and the SingularityComputers Ethereal Dual. I've only installed one of the pump and res configs because I'm still working on the cables for the Aquero D5 pump, which has the Aquabus. There's a lot of different options for how I can connect this up and configure the Aquero 6. So I'm still figuring out how I'm going to do this, because I have to do all of the cables fully custom. Might involve some soldering. Very difficult. There's a lot more work involved in the custom cables if you're going to do a full Aquero config with, you know, Aqua computer components. So looking at the bottom of the D5 pump, you can see the connectivity that I'm talking about. There's a temp sensor there, which I'm going to be connecting these bits power plug temp sensors to. And this will run back through the Aquabus to the Aquero 6. I then also need to connect up the alarm, probably to the motherboard. Usually I just use any D5 pump and run the RPM to the motherboard, and then you can still configure it through the Aqua computer software anyway, and it works great. A lot more simple, less cables, but you know, this is what the client wanted, and I can certainly understand that. So just a close look at the Aquero 6. Now, I love this component, but immediately you can see a problem with it, which I now have with every single Aquero 6. The acrylic screen comes off. It's stuck on with an adhesive. It falls off, it gets dust in behind it, the adhesive goes all over it, and it becomes an absolute mess. So I wish that Aqua Computer would create a screen that bolts on or something, you know, something that matches the quality of the rest of their components in general. Because, I mean, just take a look at this heatsink here. As somebody who is trying to get components manufactured across the globe, I know what it's like to get a component like this built. Fully CNC milled, billet aluminium, just a little heatsink. It's such a simple component, but so much engineering, design has gone into this, and cost. The quality is just excellent for a small cooling component. I mean, outsourcing something like this is near impossible. And that's why I tried to set up myself, but a lot of you know what happened with that. Very, very difficult. So we have the FARB work here, which means RGB lighting throughout this build, but I'm going to take a detailed look at all of this in the next part of the build log, when I'll be doing the custom cables for the Aquero 6 configuration. But I have everything out here ready to go, ready to start sleeving and customizing. I also have the LED strips, which are RGB obviously, and they have an interesting cable and connector, very difficult to customize. The connector clamps straight on to the LED strips themselves, and the LED strips can be shortened. But that's it for this part of the build log. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe, like, and favorite if you want to see more.